We are honored to have with us Professor Jordan Steiker and Mr. Sam Millsap, about whom I will tell you more. Both are incredibly gifted and courageous advocates for those condemned and fighters against the system of the death penalty here in Texas and across the United States. Both are lawyers, Mr. Steiker coming via clerkship on the Supreme Court, and Mr. Millsap coming via his experiences in the very tough world of a criminal prosecutor in the state of Texas. Let's greet both of them before I go any further.
Tonight, I'm going to talk about the future of the American death penalty, and I'm going to sort of tentatively state at the beginning, as I'm supposed to do, my views about where we're going with the American death penalty. And then it's going to require me to go back in time to talk about previous eras in American history to explain some of my doubts and hesitance in my own views about the future of the American death penalty. So here's my tentative view. My tentative view is that the death penalty today is more fragile and more precarious than at any time in the history of the modern death. What's the direction of the death penalty in this new experiment with democracy on the shores of the Atlantic? You would have thought that the United States 200 years later would have been an outlier in having the least amount of the death penalty and having the most progressive, most reformed death penalty. But we know that the opposite is true, that the United States remains an outlier today in being essentially the only Western democracy that has the death penalty on the books and an active death penalty practice. So during those earlier times, the concerns about the death penalty flowed primarily from concerns about human rights, human dignity. And the concern was that the death penalty creates an inappropriate relationship between the state and its citizens. States shouldn't kill their citizens. It's a denial of the human dignity of the offender. Those sorts of deontological arguments about the value of human life. Those arguments are actually rarely made in contemporary debates in state legislatures. The debates in state legislatures today are very pragmatic, and the first issue that legislatures are talking about is the issue of cost. This was an issue that was entirely absent in death penalty debates before the last decade. When cost was raised, it was always raised as a pro-prosecution, pro-death penalty argument, because of course it would cost less to execute someone than it would to imprison them for the rest of their life or for a lengthy period of time. That's proven not to be the case. The costs of the contemporary death penalty are extraordinary, especially in jurisdictions where the death penalty is largely symbolic, in that states obtain a lot of death sentences and convictions, but carry out very few executions. So on the whole, I am somewhat confident that we're on the path to the end of the death penalty. And I'm somewhat confident that if the death penalty dies, it's going to die by a judicial stroke as opposed to state-by-state repeal. State-by-state repeal just doesn't strike me as a likely prospect. I'm also slightly confident, somewhat confident, that when that day comes, when there's a judicial opinion that finds the death penalty no longer consistent with evolving standards of decency for essentially pragmatic reasons and on the basis of empirical documentation, I'm somewhat confident that that kind of opinion would be the end of the American death penalty. It would not be subject to the same kind of backlash as Furman. Thank you very much.
In the spring of 2000, I began to rethink my position on the death penalty. I became concerned as I began to read about defendants who had been convicted and who were subsequently being cleared, and cleared with regularity on the basis of DNA testing. I reviewed a massive study that was produced at Columbia University by Professor Liebman and his students. They studied 5,000 death penalty cases going back to 1973, and their conclusion was that the death penalty was collapsing under the weight of its own mistakes. What they determined was that in 68% of the cases, that the result had been a reversal of the conviction because of serious mistakes. What they also discovered was that in those cases that were retried, only 18% of the defendants were convicted of capital murder. Professor Steiker made a reference to what happened in Illinois, and what happened in Illinois had a dramatic effect on me. I was absolutely thunderstruck when the governor of Illinois commuted the death sentences of more than 160 death row inmates after a group of Northwestern University undergraduate journalism students satisfied him conclusively that 13 convicted death row inmates in that state were in fact innocent. And finally, what we saw last year that really changed the death penalty debate in this country was that the sagging economy pushed the cost of the death penalty to ground zero, and it happened in 10 states. And the result was really dramatic. New Mexico abolished the death penalty after learning that a death penalty case costs 6 times more than an ordinary murder case. Maryland narrowed its capital punishment statute so dramatically because of cost. There's not any national data on the average cost of the death penalty, but what is clear is that in all of these 10 states that are looking at the death penalty, that the driving argument that is producing the meaningful political support is cost, cost, cost. The Death Penalty Information Center last year published a report, and their conclusion was that in the 30 years since the death penalty was reinstated, that the American taxpayer has spent at least $2.5 billion and probably more on a death machine that rarely executes anyone. New York spent $170 million in less than 10 years. New Jersey spent $253 million in 25 years on the death penalty. During those 2 periods, neither one of those states executed anybody. And neither one of those states has the death penalty today. That's $400+ million in 2 states that just went into a black hole. In 1993, a Duke University study estimated that the extra cost of the death penalty in North Carolina was more than $2 million per case. Last year, another Duke economist concluded that North Carolina could save $11 million by doing away with the death penalty. In Kansas, where I was last year, Kansas asked their auditors to tell them in 2003 what the differences are between a death penalty case and a non-death penalty case. And what they were told, this is their auditors, their bean counters, not a bunch of liberals talking, okay? What they were told is that a death penalty trial in Kansas cost 15 times more than an ordinary murder trial. And the cost of a death penalty appeal is 20 times the cost of a non-death appeal. Now, Jordan talked about California. Let me bring that into slightly sharper focus. California has almost 700 death row prisoners. California has averaged less than 1 execution per year, every 2 years since 1977. California spends more than $60 million a year just to house its death row population, and recently spent $400 million, another $400 million, on a new death row facility. What happened to me is that my opposition to the death penalty took on a moral component. You can read books about the death penalty, and they're terrific, but there's nothing quite like staring into the faces of the people who have survived the death penalty. I listened to their stories. They told me about their cases. They told me what it's like to be confined in a cell that's 6 feet by 9 feet, 23 hours a day, waiting to be executed for crimes that were committed by other people. They told me what their lives have been like since exoneration, the nightmares that won't go away, what it's like to be systematically stripped for years of every vestige of human dignity and then to be released and expected to function normally on the outside. They talked about the search for stable personal relationships, the search for the ability to trust again. And finally, they talked to me, all of them talked to me about what they all had in common with one another, and that was their inability to get meaningful work. Rejections by potential employers who were confronted with legitimate concerns that remained even after innocence had been established conclusively. And you know, as I listened to them, the thing that I understood is that even though I was simpatico with where they were coming from, I probably would have made the same decisions, the same practical decisions that their potential employers made. I saw the human wreckage, the living detritus of a system that gets it wrong too often, the carnage that is produced by the very finest criminal justice system on earth, but a system that on its very best day, because it's driven by decisions that are made by imperfect human beings, produces mistakes that destroy the lives of too many innocent men and women. I heard the tortured voices of formidable men who were butchered by a system that on its worst day undermines the promise that our courts will guarantee the protection of the innocent. What abolitionists are after today, in spite of what supporters of the death penalty claim, is really not for the thousands of criminals who are waiting to die on death rows across the United States. It's for those among them, the few among them, who are innocent. But it's also for the millions of law-abiding Americans who have not forgotten the promise that we made to ourselves and each other so long ago when we agreed to give the government this awesome power that it has, and that promise was that our courts will guarantee the protection of the innocent. Those of us who oppose the death penalty recognize that this is a fight that must be won. We believe that we're being tested as a people, and we know that whether we pass this test will say a great deal more about us than it does about the people that disagree with us or the miserable creatures that commit horrible crimes in our communities. But we must never forget that we will be judged forever, not by how we treated the rich and the powerful and the well-connected, but by how we dealt with the weakest and the most miserable among us. Whether we kept the promise that our courts will guarantee the protection of the innocent. For ourselves and our children, we must do everything in our power to ensure that the judgment of history will be that we passed this test, and that when we were called on to keep the promise, we did not fail. Thank you.